Ready? Good. Good morning. Today's daf is daf Yotes 19 Maseches Nedarim. We are going to be picking up from just a quick review of the Mishnah, daf Yotes Beis, and the Gemara at the beginning, so the flow of the Gemara makes sense. We begin by thanking our sponsors. We thank the Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Mar Cheshvan, Yankee and Lisa Statman, and Yitzi and Rebecca Statman, who are sponsoring the month of learning in commemoration of the first yahrzeit of Menucha Shendel, Yehudis, Bas David Yosef, and Neshama Shehaven Aliyah and the family Shehaven Nechama. As well, we thank Shmuel and Robin Karabkin for sponsoring the month of Talmud Torah for the month of Mar Cheshvan in commemoration of the 25th yahrzeit of Robin's mother, Melanie Salman Alah Shalom, Pesamira Bas Chaim, and Neshama Shehaven Aliyah and the family Shehaven Nechama. Before I start, I don't know if I'm giving daf tomorrow yet. There's a chance that Rabbi Silva will be giving daf tomorrow. But regardless, I just wanted to thank you for the opportunity to learn with you. It's always a covet to come learn together with everybody. It's such an early hour in the morning. It's a beautiful way to start the day. So again, thank you for this chus. As we begin, yesterday we learned the Mishnah on daf Yud Ches Amud Beis, and the Mishnah taught us the halacha of stam nedarim. That means that if a person takes a neder, and his words can be interpreted one way or the other, and he's not clear about what he meant, the halacha is, we are machmir. That's what the Mishnah says. Stam nedarim lahachmir. When a person takes a neder, and it can be interpreted either in a way where the neder will take effect, and therefore he will be chayiv to keep what he said in his neder, then indeed, we are machmir. If he specifies that he meant something else, then he can get himself out of his neder by explaining I meant something else. The Gemara gives a number of examples for this. Now, the Gemara begins by asking you a question about Tanan, that there's a Mishnah that says, Safek Nazirus Lahakel. The Safek Nazirus person is always going to be Mekel. Now, Nazirus, we've explained, falls under the category of a neder. So if the halacha, as a broad umbrella statement, is that Safek Nedarim Lahachmir, then that should technically include every Safek Nazirus. Every time there's a Safek if somebody is a Nazir, then he should not be a Nazir. Then we have to understand then why does the Mishnah say Safek Nazirus is going to be if I think I said that wrong. Since Nazirus falls under the category of a neder, then anytime we have a Safek if someone is a Nazir, then we should be Machmir. The problem is the Mishnah says we are Mekel. What's the case of Safek Nazirus? So, I'm not sure if I spoke this out yesterday or not, but if you look in the Mefaresh, he says, for example, the Arminim B'Meseches Nazir, Hareini Nazir, Imzehu Ploni, Sheba Negdi Nazir. Two people are sitting around, or even one person is sitting there. The guy says, I will be a Nazir if that person who's walking by is a Nazir. And then the guy makes an about face and gets on a bus and he disappears. Now you have no idea who that person is or whether he's a Nazir or not. And you can't trace him down, you can't track him. And now you have a Safek. Well, if that person was a Nazir, so then I'm a Nazir. If that person was not a Nazir, I'm not a Nazir. So that's one of the cases where we have Safek Nazirus. And the Mishnah tells us that he's not a Nazir. Safek Nazirus Lahakel. And our Mishnah says, Safek Nedarim Lahachmir, that we are Machmir. The Gemara attempted to settle that by just saying there's a Zera suggested that there's a Machlokes Tanaim. We have the Yeshita of the Chachamim in our Mishnah who says Safek Nedarim Lahachmir, and that Mishnah is Rabbi Eliezer, and Eliezer is the one who is Mekel, and we see that from the case of the Kvi. The Kvi was the animal, which it's not clear whether it is a Chaya or the animal is a Behema. And we saw that the Mishnah says Hiktish is a Kvi. Rabbi Eliezer Emelo Hiktish. Hiktish. Detanya. For learning in a brayso, Hamakdish Chayaso Behemto. A person who's makdish his Chayos or his Behemos. Now, I should just mention, I didn't speak this out yesterday either, that there are three different opinions in the Rishon on what this means. Either it means he was makdish either his Chayos or his Behemos. In other words, not both, but either the Chaya or the Behema. So the halach is we have a machlokas between the Rabbanon and Rabbi Eliezer what the halacha is with this kvi. The kvi is not definitively a chaya, it's not definitively a behema, and therefore the halacha is that it's not included in the hektish of a chaya because maybe it's a behema. It's not included in the hektish of a behema because maybe it's a chaya. There's another opinion, which seems to be the opinion of Rashi, the Mefarish, means he is makdish all of his animals. The halacha is, still in that case, the kvi won't be included because it's still not definitively a chaya or a behema. And if you look in Tosfos, he has another explanation where he says, "Lachin nira lari to pligi b'chol inyan bein shektish shneim bein shlohiktish ela echad." And the bottom line is, according to the Ran, it's only if he was makdish his behema or his chaya. In such a case, we're going to have the opinion of the Rabbanon, who are going to say that the kvi is included, and Rabbi Eliezer is going to say the kvi is not included. According to Rashi, it's only a case where he was makdish all his behemos, and according to the Rosh, it's either or. All right, either way, we tried to settle the stira between our Mishnah and the Brisa by saying it's two different authors. Our Mishnah is the Chachamim, and the Mishnah of Nazirus is Rabbi Eliezer. The problem just was that we were not able to say that the Mishnah is going to be Rabbi Eliezer. That's where we're starting today. Amalei Abaye, b'mayu kim to l'safik Nazirus l'hakel. It's the top line. Adaf Yotesim at Aleph. You're telling me that the Safik Nazirus Lahakel is Rabbi Eliezer. It's Rabbi Eliezer who's the author of that brisa. Ema Seifa, you have to continue reading that brisa to see if indeed that fits with the rest of the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer. Safik Bacharos, a person has an animal which is a Safik Bachar. Now what's the case of the Safik Bachar? So I mentioned yesterday that it could be, if you look in Rashi, the way he explains it is, Rashi, it is the fourth line. Shlohi pila nefel kodem lechein. In other words, Rashi seems to explain that it gave birth. The question just is whether what it gave birth to at that stage had the din of an actual nefel, an actual miscarriage, or not. In other words, does that thing that it gave birth to actually absolve this animal from Bechar or not? The same thing could be by a person. If a person has a very, very early miscarriage, the question is whether or not that has a halacha of a miscarriage, and then the subsequent child that's born, is that considered the bachar or not? And according to the Ran, it's talking about where the twins were born. Certainly by an animal, this is very possible. Twins are born without anybody noticing which one came out first. It came out, one of them is a male, one of them is a female, and therefore you're just not sure which one was born first, so it's a safek bachar. Now what's the halacha? The halacha is Safik Bechoros, Echad Bechore Adam, Ve'echad Bechore Behema, Bein Temeya, Bein Tahora, Hamotzi Mechaver Ol Haraya. So whether we're talking about the firstborn of a human, or we're talking about the firstborn of an animal, whether it's an animal which is Behema Tahora, which is kosher, or an animal which is not Tahora, like a Chamar, the halacha is, if the Kohen would like to claim this Bechar, on a monetary from a monetary perspective, he would have to be the one to prove that it's indeed a bachar. He's going to have to do his research to find out and indeed prove to the owner that the animal is a bachar. So like this, he could claim that the animal belongs to him. There's always an inherent problem with this, that Kohen is not one person. Kohen is a whole group of people. So therefore, even if you prove it, who says they have to give it to you? Maybe I can give it to another Kohen. There's a number of ways of understanding this. Either it could be the Kohen entity proves it, or that there's a specific Kohen that was accustomed to being the one to get the bachar of this family, and therefore that's what it would be talking about. All right. Either way, so the halach is from a monetary perspective, he would have to prove that it is a bachar, and in absence of that proof, he cannot take the bachar or collect the money for the pigeon aben from the owner or the father of this newborn child. However, B'tani Allah, we explained about that halacha that even though the halacha is that from a monetary perspective, in the financial aspect of this, the Kohen has to bring a proof. However, nevertheless, the halacha is v'asurim b'giz v'avoda. From an isser v'heter perspective, we still treat this animal you can't shear it, and you can't do work with it. We treat it as a bechar. So we see clearly that even in that brisa, we were talking about Sveikos, Rabbi Eliezer was going to be machmir. So how could both of them work out? So therefore, the Gemara says, so Amalei, Amai kamadam with kedusha ba me'alel, kedusha ba b'dei adam. How are you comparing the case of bechar to a case of nazirus or a case of nedarim? A case of nedarim and nazirus, both of those cases are cases where the person themselves is accepting upon themselves the kedusha, either the kedusha of the nazirus or the kedusha of the neder. But bechar is naturally born that way. In other words, the fact that Eliezer is machmir by a bechar to tell you that perhaps this is a bechar, it's a regular old suffix deraisa. An animal is born, perhaps it's a bechar, and the bechar comes along with certain halachos. That being the case, you have to be machmir and treat it as if it's a bechar. That's not like a major chiddush. Rabbi Eliezer is talking about where a person accepts upon himself kedusha of either nazirus or perhaps in our Mishnah by a neder. So then we could have that Rabbi Eliezer is going to be meiko. But why are you asking me a question from bechar? The truth is that this is such an obvious question that it's a little bit difficult to even understand what the Gemara was thinking when the Gemara tried to ask this question on Rabbi Eliezer. So in other words, let's just summarize. At this point in time, we have a Mishnah which says Safek Nedarim Lahachmir. We have a Brisa which says, another Mishnah in Maseches Tyrus that says Safek Nazirus Lahakel. We're trying to reconcile these two things. How could both of these statements be true? That Safek Nedarim is always going to be Lahachmir and Safek Nazirus is always going to be Lahakel. The only answer we came up with so far is that they're two different authors. Our Mishnah are the Chachamim, and the Mishnah in Tyrus is Rabbi Eliezer. We tried to say that it can't be Rabbi Eliezer because of this case of Becharos, but ultimately we said that has nothing to do with anything. So therefore, at this point, we're still okay with the Brisa in Tyrus being Rabbi Eliezer. Now, the problem is, the Gemara says, Al-I kasha, ha-kasha. If there's any kasha on establishing that Mishnah to be Rabbi Eliezer, this is the kasha. Safek mashkin l'tamei tamei. So this is a Tosefta. It's also Gemara in Maseches Psachim. Just by way of introduction, the pasuk says Chamashka she yishasa, and it should become tamei. Now the question just is yitame. The question just is, what does that mean? There's a three-way machlokes what it means when we talk about liquids becoming tamei. Just to try to simplify it as much as possible, there's three possibilities. Either that it's fully tamei. That means it becomes tamei and has the ability to be able to be tamei other things. The other way of understanding it is that it can't become tamei, but it can be matami others. And then there's the last opinion of ein lamashkin tuma kol ikar, that there's no tuma by mashkin midoraisa. So three different levels. Either it's fully tamei, or midoraisa there's no tuma, or there's like the middle category that it can't become tamei itself, but it can transmit tuma. It could be machshir other things to be bekabel tuma. So let's see how this works out. Safek mashkin litamei. You have mashkin, which is a suffix if it became tamei. In other words, somebody tamei stretched their hand in. We're not sure if this person touched it and made it tamei or not. So suffix mashkin litamei, to become itself, the halacha is tamei. Indeed, it's going to be tamei. Litamei acherim, to transfer tuma somewhere else, the halacha is tahar. In other words, it can't transfer tuma misafik. If we're in doubt as to whether or not it was matami something else, it's tahar. Divi Rabbi Meir. These are the words of Rabbi Meir. Chen haya Rabbi Lazar Omer kedvarav. Rabbi Lazar said the same thing as Rabbi Meir. Now we immediately have to point out that if we're having a discussion today about the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, and we're going to bring in Rabbi Elazar, then we have to make sure we're talking about the same person. And you have to just stop here and say, there's got to be one of these that are a mistake. Because if we're bringing Rabbi Elazar in here, and the original one was Rabbi Eliezer, so then the whole thing is not relevant. So now the reason why it has to be Rabbi Elazar in this case is because simply, historically, it can't be that Rabbi Eliezer says like Rabbi Meir, because Rabbi Eliezer lived before Rabbi Meir. So therefore, it can't be Rabbi Eliezer, and therefore this particular Tosefta must be Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua. Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua indeed could have said like Rabbi Meir. Rashash points out that if that's the case, we have to understand that the previous Rabbi Elazar is also Rabbi Elazar, not Rabbi Eliezer. Just a small detail, but an important detail. Rabbi Elazar Omer Kedvarav, Rabbi Elazar would say, just like Rabbi Meir. In other words, Rabbi Elazar is of the opinion that, with regard to becoming Tameh itself, in the case of a Safek, in the case of doubt, it's Tameh. With regard to transferring Tumah, ritual impurity somewhere else, when it's a Safek, we do not transfer the Tumah. Now the Gemara says, Umisvirle Rabbi Elazar L'Tameh Tameh. Can it be that Rabbi Elazar is of the opinion that it can become Tameh? The problem is, Vatanya, we have a brisa that Rabbi Elazar Omer ein Tumah Lamashkin Kol Iker. Rabbi Elazar is of the opinion, like the last opinion that we mentioned, that mashkin liquids can't become Tameh Midoraisa altogether. Kol Iker means Midoraisa. So in other words, once we established now that Rabbi Elazar is of the opinion that ein Tumah Lamashkin Kol Iker, liquids can't become Tameh by themselves, Midoraisa. Now how do we know that? Teida, we'll prove it to you. Shaharei, Heyid Yosi ben Yoezer ish tzreida, al ayil kamtza dachein. Heyid Yosi ben Eliezer. Whenever you see Heyid, you should almost always know that's Mishnah in Idios, because Idios is really testifying in the Mishnayos they memorized. So Yosi ben Yoezer testified that al ayil kamtza, on a certain type of grasshopper, dachein, that it is kosher. It's not tameh, and it is kosher. This has nothing to do with what we're discussing. It's just part of that piece of testimony that he is reporting. But what is important is pa'al mashkin beis mitbachaya, and on the liquids that are found literally in the butcher shop of the Beis HaMikdash, where they would skin the animals, they would cut up the animals. Mashkin liquids found in that area, dachein, they are tahar. They are ritually pure. Now, why is it that it's tahar? The reason is Chazal did not want to have extra tumah in the Beis HaMikdash. The Beis HaMikdash was a very sensitive area to tumah and taira, and if things became tameh, it always caused lots of problems. So therefore, we tried to minimize scenarios where things will become tameh. Now, what he's saying is that the Chachamim said that liquids in the Beis HaMikdash will not become tameh. Now, hold on a second. If liquids become tameh midoraisa, the Chachamim don't have a right to say, you know what, it's too inconvenient for us to have this tum over here, so we're going to suspend the halacha that liquid become tameh. It just doesn't work that way. The Torah says it is tameh. It must be then that if Rabbi Elazar is reporting what Yosi ben Yoezer said, that all liquids found in the Beis HaMikdash are going to be tahar, the reason why that would be the case is because midoraisa, there's no tumah by liquids. So there's no tumah by liquids, and therefore, midrabanan, there is tumah, but in the Beis HaMikdash, Chazal suspended that tumah midrabanan, because he did not want to have any unnecessary tumah. So now, hanicha l'Shmuel, this all works out according to Shmuel, the Amar dachein milatame acherim, aval tumas atzman yesh bahen, shapir. According to Shmuel, if Yosi ben Yoezer meant that it can't itself become tameh, but it can't transfer tumah, fine. We could understand that Chazal, he was talking about that. He was talking about the transferring of tumah. Midoraisa, there is tumah that in itself can inherently become tameh, but it can't transfer tumah. So therefore, Chazal said, we're not going to allow it to transfer tumah in the Beis HaMikdash either. El larav d'amar dachein mamish, that it's completely tahar. And it doesn't have any tumah at all, not itself, and it can't transfer tumah. So again, to be clear, dachein means it's pure. How pure? According to Shmuel, it means it's pure from transferring tumah, but it in itself does remain tameh. Okay, so that's fine. At least there is some tumah there. But according to Rav, who says that dachein means completely tar, there's no tumah at all in the mashkin, so then it must be that Rabbi Elazar is of the opinion that there is no tumah at all on mashkin midoraisa. So now what's the problem? So, what's the problem? What does this have to do with what we're learning? So the simplest way to explain this is the Ran has a little bit of an arichas over here. If you look in Rashi, the fourth wide line of Rashi, the Mefarish, El Larav de Amar Dachin Mamish, de Ein Tuma Lamashkin Kol Iker. There's no Tuma in liquids at all. Amai Ka'amar Rabbi Lazar Hacha Safik Mashkin Letame Tame. We quoted Rabbi Lazar earlier saying that Safik Mashkin Letame Tame. Again, we just were forced to establish that according to Rabbi Lazar, there's no Tuma Midoraisa on liquids. That's the important thing to take away from this. According to Rabbi Lazar, we must conclude that there's absolutely no Tuma by liquids Midoraisa. Any Tuma by liquids is going to be Midrabana. Now let's back up a few lines. Hold on, what does it say? Safek mashkin letame. If you have a safek, if liquid became tamei, what's the halacha? Tamei. Why is it tamei? So we're basically just comparing two different areas of drabanan. By Naziris, he says it's lahakel. Safek Naziris is for a kula, even though it's... And when it comes to Tuma, which is drabanan, he's going to be machmir. So how could both of those things stay alive? That's the Gemara's question on Rabbi Lazar, and therefore what the Gemara ultimately says is, Ella, it must be that we can't say that the Mara Deshmaitzer, or in other words, the author of the Brisa of Nazirus is going to be Rabbi Lazar. It must be somebody else. In other words, all of this because our Mishnah said Safek Nedarim lahachmir. We quoted another Mishnah that says Safek Nazirus lahakel. We tried to say the author of that Mishnah of Nazirus is Rabbi Elazar. We just proved that Rabbi Elazar is machmir by Drabanan. So therefore, can't be that Mishnah in Tyrus is Rabbi Elazar. So who is it going to be? The Gemara says Ella. Rather, we must say Ha Rabbi Yehuda, Ha Rabbi Shimon. It's not the machlokes Drabanan and Rabbi Eliezer. It is our Mishnah is machlokes of Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon. What's the case? The Tanya. For we learned in the Brisa, Hareini Nazir im yesh b'krizeh meyakor. A person said, I'm going to look at this pile of grain. If indeed there is 100 kor, which is a measurement inside this pile, then I'll be a Nazir. He went to go ahead and measure to see if there's 100 kor to determine whether or not he's a Nazir. And what happens? Turns out the whole pile was stolen, or part of the pile was stolen, or it got lost, and now he can't accurately measure it anymore. Therefore, he has no idea if he's a Nazir. Rabbi Yehuda, matir. Rabbi Yehuda says it's mutter, which is Safek Naziris lahakel. Fits perfectly. It's exactly the case we're talking about. Shimon Oser, Shimon says it's Aser. So Shimon is going to be the Tana of our Mishnah. Rabbi Yehuda is going to be the Tana of the Mishnah in Tyros, which discusses the case of Safek Naziris. So the Gemara says, V'rami, Rabbi Yehuda, ad Rabbi Yehuda. We have a stira from Rabbi Yehuda on Rabbi Yehuda. What is the stira? Because mi Amar Rabbi Yehuda, lo ma'ayel inish gufe l'sfeika. Is it true that Rabbi Yehuda is the one who says a person will not elevate himself to an ear of Kedusha when there's a suffix? In other words, it's a fancy way of saying that when there's a suffix of a Nazir, he's not going to become a Nazir. V'raminu, we have a stira. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, stam truma b'Yehuda asura. In our Mishnah itself, Yehuda says, Stam Truma, a person says this should be like Truma. If he lives in Yehuda, it's Aser. Uba Galil, if he lives in the Galil, then Mutaris, it's going to be Mutter. Why? The Mishnah explains, She'ein Anche HaGalil Makirin es Truma Salishka. The people of Galil don't really, they're not so familiar with Truma Salishka. They're not so familiar with donations to the Bedek Kabayis, and therefore, when they say Truma, they mean Truma Sagoren, which goes to the Kohen. So just a quick review. If it's Truma Salishka, then that is a Davar HaNodor, and therefore it's going to be a valid Neder. If it's Truma Sagoren, then it's not Davar HaNodor, it's Truma, it's something which is an Isser. But the truth is, it's going to be Asr because it's not a valid Lashon of a Neder. and therefore it's not going to work because it's the truma of a kohen. Now the Gemara says, Taima, what's the reason why in Galil we're going to say they're referring to Trumas Halishka, to Ein Kirin, because they don't recognize, they're not so familiar with Trumas Halishka. Turn to Daf Yitesum Beis, Hamakirin, what if they would recognize Asurin? It would be Asur. So the inference over here is that if they would be Makir, it would be Machmir. So again, we have an interesting thing here. According to Rabbi Yehuda, he says very clearly Safek Naziris is going to be Mekel, but the inference of our Mishnah is that if they would recognize Trumas Halishka, we would be Machmir, because Safek Nedarim Lahachmir. Samarava, there's a big difference. Gabe Kri Kasavar, when it comes to this pile over here, Kasavar Kol Sveiko, Chamor, Kolshes Sveiko, Chamor Mivadai, Lo Ma'ayil Nafshil Sveika. When it comes to this case, if the Safek is going to be more Chamor than the Vadai, we're not going to impose the Chumrah. In other words, it's true. Rabbi Yehuda is of the opinion that sometimes when it comes to a neder, we're going to be machmir, we're going to be stringent in the case of a Safek, but not where the Safek is going to be more chamor than the Vadai. What does that mean? Remember, the case was a person said, I will be a Nazir if there are 100 kor inside this pile. Now the halacha is, if it's a Safek in such a case, it's more chamor, then he certainly becomes a neder. Why? Dil gabe Nazir Vadai. When a person is certainly a Nazir, what happens? Migaleach maybe carbon v'nechal. We know exactly what his halacha is. You're certainly a Nazir. Carry out your period of time as a Nazir. Take your haircut. Bring your carbon. And then you're good to go. You're out of being a Nazir. However, Val Sveiko, when it comes to a Safek, lo matzi migaleach. He can't, because there's a problem, because if he's not really a Nazir, he can't bring a carbon. Why not? Because it's Chulin Lazara. Can't just walk in with the carbon into the base of the mikdash and say, here's my carbon. It has to be a relevant carbon. So you can't bring a chatas if you're not really a Nazir. So therefore, he finds himself to be in a very, very tight position when he is a Safek Nazir. So therefore, in the case of Naziros, says Rabbi Yehuda, I'm always going to be makel to say, don't allow the guy to come Nazir in the first place when it's a Safek, because we don't want to have Safek Naziros. We don't want to have people who are Safek Nazir because it's very difficult to figure out how they get out of it. So the Gemara says, Amalei Rav Huna bar Yehuda l'Rava, Amar Hareini Nazir l'Olamai. Remember, you said Safek Naziros, which is a very broad term. Now that means every case. What if the person said Hareini Safek Nazir l'Olam? So in such a case, he wants to be Nazir forever. So in that case, the Safek won't be more chamer than the Vadai, because a Vadai Nazir la'olam also doesn't take a haircut. He also doesn't bring a carbon. He also doesn't get out of it. So what's the difference between being a Vadai Nazir and a Safek Nazir? Gemara says, Nazir la'olam nami sveko chamer mi Vadai. You're incorrect. A Safek Nazir la'olam also it's worse than a Vadai. Why the ilu Vadai when it by a person who's certainly a Nazir, hichbit sairo, if his hair becomes too heavy, Mekel Batar, he could take a haircut. Maybe Shalosh Behemos, he brings 3 karbanos. Vilu Sveiko, however, when it comes to a Safek Nazir, lo, he can't do that. So Safek Nazir La'olam cannot bring these karbanos. He cannot go ahead and take a haircut. So indeed, a Safek Nazir La'olam is more chamor than a Vadei Nazir La'olam. However, Amar Hareini Nazir Shimshon, what if he says Nazir Shimshon? Nazir Shimshon is the most intense level of Nazir. He can't take a haircut even if his hair becomes too heavy. So what about that case? Because remember, we said Safek Nazir Lahakil, which should include everything. So you said Amalei Nazir Shimshon Lotanya. We weren't talking about that. You're right. Indeed, Nazir Shimshon is not included. Amarlei va'amar of Ada Parahava Tanya Nazir Shimshon. How could you tell me that we're not talking about Nazir Shimshon? Rav Barhava says we are talking about Nazir Shimshon. Amalei Itanya Tanya. If it says it, it says it. What does that mean? So this is similar to a kasha. When the Gemara says kasha, it's a good question. You're quoting Rabbi Barahav over here who says that Nazir Shimshon is included. That was not my Mesorah. I didn't have Nazir Shimshon included in this. You do. It's a good question. I don't have an answer for you. If it's in your brisa, it's in your brisa. But ultimately, he's still saying the brisa could stay alive. In other words, it's not a steer in Rabbi Yehuda. We don't have a contradiction in Rabbi Yehuda. Your brisa has nazir shimshon, mine doesn't. But ultimately, I'm explaining to you that the reason why Rabbi Yehuda is sometimes going to be machmir when it comes to a nazir, and sometimes not going to be machmir, is because when it comes to a safek nazir, Rabbi Yehuda does not want there to be safek naziros, because for the most part, in most cases, a safek nazir finds himself being in a much more intense, stringent situation than a Vadei Nazir, and therefore he didn't want to do it. However, when it came to another case, our Mishnah of a Safek, so therefore he would be machmir by that neder. Okay. Rashi Amar, Hahi Rabbi Yehuda Mishum Rabbi Tarfon. Rashi answered the stira by saying there's a different Rabbi Yehuda over here. This is Rabbi Yehuda in the name of Rabbi Tarfon. Who is Rabbi Tarfon? Titania. Yehuda Mishum Rabbi Tarfon. We learn. Yehuda says the name Rabbi Tarfon. Yehuda Mishum Rabbi Tarfon Omer. Ein echad mehen nazir. What's that talking about? So this is very cryptic, and therefore we have to be very thankful to the Ran for giving us the case. If you look in the Ran, Ein echad mehen nazir, I would say somewhere around 10 lines in the skinnier lines, the more narrow lines of Rashi. Starts with the Dibur Maska at the beginning of the line. Ein echad mehen nazir. V'mesachas nazir tnan. There are two people walking on the road. They saw someone coming towards them. One of them said, Hareini Nazir. I will be a Nazir. Shezeh ish ploni. That guy is so and so. So Omar Chavero, Hareini Nazir she'eno. I will become a Nazir if he's not that person. So basically, right, heads I win, tails you lose. Right? If he is the guy, I'm a Nazir. If he's not the guy, then the other guy is a Nazir. Neither of them become a Nazir. And the Gemara explains. Let's go back to the Gemara. Why? Rabbi Tarfon is of the opinion that Nazirus is one of those cases where you have to be very, very clear about what you're saying. If you're not going to be extremely careful about what you say and very, very accurate in your description of what you're planning to do, then Nazirus doesn't take effect. It's not chal. So that, in other words, that is the Rabbi Yehuda that we're talking about. Rabbi Yehuda, that case of Rabbi Yehuda was talking about the Rabbi Yehuda in the name of Rabbi Tarfon. So Yihachi my Aryeh shenignav sha'avad. If indeed, again, just to understand, the case of Kri, a person says, if there are 100 kor inside this pile, I'll become a Nazir. We're now explaining that that's not the real Rabbi Yehuda. That's Rabbi Yehuda in the name of Rabbi Tarfon. Who's Rabbi Tarfon? Rabbi Tarfon is of the opinion that a person can't become a Nazir unless they are extremely clear in their language about what they mean. If there's any doubt about what they mean, says Rabbi Yehuda in the name of Rabbi Tarfon, then there's no Nazirus taking effect. There's no effect of Nazirus. So hold on a second. If that's the case, then why is it, my area, why do we need to be talking about a case of shenignav o she'avad, that it got stolen or it got lost? Because remember, according to Rabbi Tarfon, if when you say it, I can't definitively know that you're a Nazir until I go ahead and measure out a pile, so then you shouldn't be a Nazir. In other words, just like the case of when a guy's walking down the street. Imagine, you're sitting at the corner of a street on a bench, and 2 blocks down, a guy's walking. You see a little silhouette of a person coming down the block. You can't tell what the person's facial features look like. You can't recognize them. So Ruvain says, if that's Yehuda, I'm a Nazir. Shimon says, if that's not Yehuda, I'm a Nazir. What's the halacha according to Rabbi Tarfon? Regardless of who the person is, none of them are a Nazir. Why? Because when the person expressed that they're going to become a Nazir, it wasn't very clear that going to be a Nazir. It has to be very clear at that point in time that they're a Nazir. Okay, if that's the case, and even the person passes by later, none of them are a Nazir, so why is that not the same halach when it comes to a pile? Person says, I'm a Nazir if there's 100 kor inside this pile. Now, regardless of whether you measure it or not, at the time that he spoke, it wasn't clear that he's a Nazir. And therefore, he shouldn't be a Nazir. Why does that brisa need to speak out that what happened was it was stolen and therefore you couldn't measure it? Makes it sound like if it would still be here and we could measure it out, and indeed find out that there are 100 kor, he would be a nazir. But according to Rabbi Tarfon, that's not true. Because even if it's ultimately determined that the guy was Yehuda, or that the pile did have 100 kor in it, he wouldn't be a nazir because his language at the time that he accepted the nazirus upon himself was not clear. The Gemara says, Elo, we must say the reason why it said Shenigav or Shenevad was Rabbi Shimon, just because Rabbi Shimon was the one who disagreed. He was the one who dissented on the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, and he says, you will be a neder, so the afal gav the nignav o nevad, kasavar ma'al nafshel sveker. Rabbi Shimon is so machmir in this case, that even though we don't know definitively that there was 100 kor in there, nevertheless, says Rabbi Shimon that the halacha is he's going to be a nazir. So two polar opposites. According to Rabbi Yehuda, in the name of Rabbi Tarfon, the halacha is if at the time that the person articulates that he's accepting upon himself nazirus, it's not 100% clear at that moment that he's a nazir, no nazirus. Even if later we find out that his condition was met. Because nazirus needs to be absolutely clear. And that's what it means, safek nazirus lahakol. Safek nazirus lahakil means that if there is any question at the time that the person accepted upon himself nazirus as to whether or not he's going to become a nazir, according to Rabbi Yehuda, no nazirus. No nazirus at all. Now, and that is Rabbi Yehuda in the name of Rabbi Tarfon. Shimon, he disagrees. He says it's kind of like on standby. Person says, I'm a nazir if either that person is going to be Yehuda, or there's 100 kor in that pile. Says Rabbi Shimon, you're going to be a nazir. And you know what? Even if we lose the pile, or the guy makes an about face, and he goes the other direction, according to Rabbi Shimon, he's going to be a nazir, even if we can't definitively say it was Yehuda, or that there was 100 kor in that pile. Now, we did have a stira, and that is Rabbi Yehuda in his own opinion, and that was the case that we explained, that there was a safek nazirus. And safek nazirus, Yehuda did not want to have being more chomer than Avadi Nazirus. All right. The Mishnah said, if Yehuda Omer, Stam Truma be Yehuda. Stam Truma in Yehuda, we said the halacha is, we assume for it to be Trumas Halishka. And therefore, the neder is going to work. So the Gemara says, Hamakirin, Asurin. Let's turn back to the Mishnah for a second so we remember what the line is. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Stam Truma Yehuda. This is 4 lines before the end of the Mishnah. A person simply says Truma and Yehuda, the halacha is it's asur, but in Galil it's going to be mutter. In Galil it's going to be mutter. Why? Says the Mishnah, She'ein Anchi Galil Makirin es Truma Salishka. When people in Galil talk about Truma, they're not talking about donations to the Beis HaMikdash, they're talking about the Truma going to the Kohen. Now let's focus on the next line as well. Stam charamim b'Yehuda, person uses the word cherem. In Yehuda mutarin, begalil asurin. In Galil it's going to be asur. Why? She'ein anshe Galil makirin es charamei kohanim. People of Galil are not so familiar to cherem of kohanim. Okay, so now the Gemara looks at this and says, ha makirin asurin. If the people of Galil would be makir, would be familiar with Trumas Halishka, then it would be aser. Al masfek l'chumra. We see that when there's a safek, we're being machmir. Ema seifa. Now let's read the next line which we just read. Stam charam. And a person simply says something should be aser, like a cherem. Be Yehuda, in the city of Yehuda it's mutter. Ubegalil, in Galil it's going to be aser. Why? She'ein anshi hagalil makirin es charamei kohanim. The people of Galil are not familiar of the cherem of kohanim, and therefore they must not have meant the cherem of kohanim, and therefore it's going to be aser. Now, remember, cherem of kohanim can't be a valid lashon of neder because the cherem of kohanim, it's actually mutter. It's being noder b'davar ha-mutter. In other words, we have 3 things. There's a person making neder b'davar ha-nador. He associates something mutter with something which became aser by way of his neder. There is associating something which is mutter with a davar ha'asor, which is from the Torah's perspective, it becomes asor. And then there's associating a davar hamutter with a davar hamutter. So both associating with a davar ha'asor and with a davar hamutter is not going to be a valid neder. The only time it's a valid neder is when a person associates his davar hamutter, his personal lunch, with a davar hanadar. So now, in the case of Charami Kehanim, it's actually mutter, so that's why it's not a valid neder. But the inference over there is the mashmos is hamakirin, if they would be familiar with Charami Kehanim, would be mutter. It's almost fake lakula. We see this suffix is lakula. In other words, if you look deeply into this, what we're essentially saying is, since they're not familiar with it, therefore, either asur or mutter. Now, hold on a second. If they're not familiar with it, so then what's happening over here is we have a suffix. But if they would be familiar, we would either be machmir or mekel. Now, which one is it? When they are familiar and it's a suffix, are we machmir or are we mekel? So we have a stira. Amar Abaya, Sefer Rabbi Tzadiki. The Sefer, the last line of the Mishnah, is not the same person. It's Rabbi Tzaddik, the Tanya Behuda Omer, Stam Trum Behuda Asura, Stam Trum and Yehuda is Asur. Rabbi Tzaddik Omer, Stam Charamim Begalil Asurim, Stam Charamim, Stam Lashon of Cherim in Galil is going to be Asur. So you're right. There is a contradiction in the inference of what this means over here, but it's not a problem because there's two different people speaking. We'll stop here. Have a wonderful day and a wonderful week. We'll find out tomorrow if I'm learning with you or not. But either way, it's been a covet to learn with you the last week.
Hopefully you'll find out sooner. You might want to give it a text.
You know how to turn this Zoom off over here? Have a great day, everybody.
You told me 2 dials, turn them down.
Yeah. So we'll turn off the Zoom. Does the YouTube